The jungle does not care who you are. It does not care about your rank, your record, or the medals pinned to your chest back in Washington. It does not care about the 3 years you spent at West Point, or the commendations your commanding officer wrote when he still believed in you. The jungle in northern Luzon, Philippines, in the autumn of 1944, cared about exactly one thing: whether you survived the next 10 minutes. Most men didn't. On the morning of October the 17th, 1944, a supply convoy of 11 American trucks wound its way along a narrow logging road carved into the hills northeast of Lingayen. The road was barely wide enough for a single vehicle. On one side, the mountain rose straight up, thick with mahogany and vine. On the other side, it dropped 200 feet into a river gorge. The drivers had been told the route was clear. They had been told reconnaissance had swept it the night before. They had been told a lot of things that turned out not to be true. The ambush began at the third bend. A felled tree blocked the road, not fallen, felled, cut deliberately the night before and dragged into position while American sentries slept. Before the lead driver could shift into reverse, the first anti-tank gun opened up from the tree line at point-blank range. Then the second gun, then the machine guns on both flanks. The whole thing lasted 8 minutes. When the shooting stopped, 11 trucks sat destroyed along a quarter-mile stretch of road. Black smoke rose above the canopy in columns so thick they were visible from 20 miles away. No one walked out. This was not an isolated incident. By October 1944, this pattern had repeated itself across northern Luzon so many times that American commanders had given it an informal name: the Bend and Block. The Japanese 14th Area Army under General Tomoyuki Yamashita had studied the terrain, studied American logistics, and built a defensive strategy around a simple, brutal truth. On these roads, in this jungle, an unarmored convoy was not a supply line. It was a target. The solution, according to every senior officer at the headquarters of the 6th United States Army, was obvious: more tanks, heavier armor, M4 Shermans, ideally, pushing through in force with enough firepower to overwhelm any roadblock before it could be set. The logic was sound, on paper. On the roads of Luzon, it ran into a different kind of logic, the kind that does not negotiate, because the roads of Luzon were not built for Sherman tanks. Many of the bridges crossing the mountain streams in the interior had been constructed by local Filipino engineers during the 1920s and 1930s, built of timber and iron to carry farm trucks and carts. A Sherman weighed 30 tons. Most of those bridges held 8. The Japanese infantry knew this. Yamashita's engineers knew this. The American planners in their headquarters buildings in Leyte, surrounded by maps that showed roads but not load ratings, did not know this, or chose not to dwell on it. Into this situation, in the third week of October 1944, came Lieutenant Colonel Doyle Merritt. Doyle Merritt was 38 years old, lean in the way men who have been moving constantly for 3 years tend to become lean, with dark eyes that had developed the habit of reading a room before he entered it. He had grown up in rural Georgia, the youngest son of a Baptist minister who believed that a man's word was either worth everything or nothing at all. No middle ground, no negotiation, no comfortable grey. That particular inheritance had served Merritt well in some situations and very badly in others. He had commanded men since North Africa. He understood armor, understood reconnaissance, understood the specific mathematics of keeping soldiers alive on terrain that was actively trying to kill them. His efficiency reports, filed in the system at the War Department, used words like capable, decisive, and tactically sound. What they did not use, what no one in the chain of command above him had ever quite managed to commit to paper, was the other word. The one that explained why a man with his record was standing in a temporary command post on Leyte on October the 23rd, 1944, being handed an assignment that no one else wanted. The officer who handed it to him was a colonel named Pitts, a staff officer, not a field commander, with clean boots and the careful manner of a man who delivers difficult news for a living. Pitts placed the orders on the folding table between them and did not quite meet Merritt's eyes. The 9th Mechanized Reconnaissance Regiment had, until 72 hours prior, been equipped with M3 half-tracks and jeep-mounted machine gun sections. It was a workable unit, not glamorous, reconnaissance regiments rarely were, but functional. Then the orders came down from 6th Army headquarters, reassigning all half-tracks to the 1st Cavalry Division, which was being prioritized for the main push up the Central Plain. The 9th Regiment would receive replacement vehicles within the week. What arrived was not what anyone had expected. 23 and 8 Scout armored cars sat in a motor pool on the south edge of the airfield. Wheeled, four-wheel drive, 7.1 tons each, with a 37mm main gun, a coaxial machine gun, and armor that ranged from 14mm at the front to 10 on the sides. They were not tanks, they were not half-tracks. They were something that occupied an awkward, in-between category that the American military in the Pacific had largely decided, after limited testing, it did not have much use for. The official assessment, signed 6 weeks earlier by Brigadier General Clifford Breckinridge, commander of the armored forces attached to 6th Army, used clear language. M8 type-wheeled armored vehicles are assessed as unsuitable for operations in mountainous jungle terrain. Recommend restriction to rear area security and liaison duties only. Merritt read that line twice, then he folded the orders and put them in his breast pocket. Colonel Pitts offered the standard reassurance that the regiment's mission parameters would be appropriately limited, that no one expected wheeled vehicles to perform in a frontline role, that this was a temporary assignment pending re-equipment. He used the word temporary 3 times in 4 minutes. Merritt noticed that. He did not say what he was thinking. What he was thinking was, temporary is what men say when they have already decided something is permanent but do not want to be the ones to admit it. He signed the transfer papers and went to meet his regiment. Edmund Whitfield found him the following morning. Whitfield was 44 years old, a mechanical engineer from Detroit who had spent the better part of the last 5 years attached to the Ordnance Department as a civilian technical advisor, which was a formal way of saying that when something mechanical broke down in ways the Army did not understand, they sent for Whitfield. He was tall, angular, with the kind of deliberate precision in his movements that engineers sometimes develop when they have spent years working around things that could kill them if handled incorrectly. He had flown in from Manila specifically to brief the incoming commander of the 9th Regiment on the vehicles. It was, in his view, a professional obligation. Someone who was going to take these machines into combat ought to know what they actually were, as opposed to what the assessment report said they were. They stood together in the motor pool in the early morning before the heat built into something serious, walking the line of parked M8 Scouts. Whitfield ran his hand along the welded seam of the turret and said nothing for a moment. Then, "You know what kills men inside armored vehicles? It is not always the round that penetrates. Sometimes the round strikes the outside, and the rivets, the bolts holding the armor plates together, they shear off inward. Small pieces of metal moving very fast inside a sealed compartment. Every man inside is hit before anyone fires a second shot." Merritt looked at the turret. "There are no rivets," he said. "No," Whitfield said. "The body is welded, single continuous shell. The design was refused by the War Department 3 times between 1938 and 1940. The official position was that welded armor construction was not sufficiently proven for field application." He paused. "We proved it. They ordered it anyway, eventually, because by 1941 there was no other option, and the production numbers required more capacity than the existing approved designs could supply." Whitfield moved to the front of the vehicle and crouched, placing his palm flat on the forward hull plate. 7.1 tons, he said. "That is not an accident. The timber bridges in the interior of Luzon, The ones marked on the engineering surveys from the 1930s, most of them are rated for farm vehicles up to 12 tons. A Sherman cannot cross them. This vehicle can, not because we designed it for this theatre. We didn't. Nobody thought about Luzon when they drew these plans in Detroit. But the numbers work out. He stood up and looked at Merritt directly. General Breckinridge's assessment was written after 2 weeks of trials on a training ground in Georgia. Flat ground, dry season, against paper targets. No one ran these vehicles across improvised timber bridges. No one tested the noise signature against tracked vehicles on a jungle road at night. He picked up a small stone from the ground and turned it over in his fingers. Tracked vehicles, Shermans, half-tracks, you can hear them coming from a mile away in a jungle environment. The vibration travels through the ground. Every animal in the canopy moves. Sentries on a ridge can detect them by the canopy disturbance before they ever see the vehicle. He set the stone down on the hood. This vehicle, on a paved road at speed, at night. The reconnaissance units that tested it in North Africa reported that forward observers at 400 yards could not reliably distinguish it from a truck. Merritt was quiet for a moment. Quiet. What is the gun rated against? The 37mm M6, same weapon fitted to the Stuart light tank. Armor-piercing rounds will penetrate 42mm of vertical plate at 500 yards. Sufficient against every Japanese armored vehicle currently operating in the Philippines, high explosive rounds for fixed positions, and canister. Whitfield paused briefly. Each canister shell contains 122 precision steel balls. At combat range, under 250 yards, against exposed infantry in the open, the effect is comparable to a large-gauge shotgun at close range, multiplied. There was a silence that falls between men when something important has been said, and both of them know it. Merritt looked down the line of parked vehicles. 23 of them. Their crews were already moving around the motor pool, checking fluid levels, running through morning maintenance. Young men, most of them had never seen combat. Some of them had been assigned to this regiment, he suspected, through the same process that had assigned him a system, finding a place to put people it was not quite sure what to do with. The assessment report, Merritt said finally. Breckinridge signed it personally. He did. And the re-equipment timeline. When are we actually getting half-tracks? Whitfield looked at him steadily. I don't believe you are, he said it without inflection. Not cruelty, just the plain delivery of a man who respects the person he is speaking to enough not to dress the truth in anything softer. Merritt nodded slowly. He already knew. He had known from the moment Colonel Pitts said the word temporary for the third time. Some assignments are not temporary. Some assignments are a door being closed in a particular and irreversible way. The question is never whether the door is closed. The question is what you do on the side of it you are standing on. That night, after Whitfield had flown back to Manila, Merritt sat alone in the motor pool with a flashlight and a clipboard. He went through every vehicle in the regiment. He checked the maintenance logs, the fuel loads, the ammunition stores. He read, for the third time that day, the translated extract from a Japanese intelligence document captured 2 weeks earlier at Leyte, forwarded to all regimental commanders as a general intelligence notice. The document was a field report written by an unidentified Japanese staff officer, dated September 1944. It had been written in the margin of a tactical map, which suggested it was composed in the field rather than at a headquarters. The translated version read, American Wheeled Armored Unit observed, moving northeast along Route 12 after dark. No sound signature detected from observation post until vehicles were within 100 meters. Unit does not appear in standard American order of battle references. No established countermeasure. Request guidance from division. No guidance had been issued. The document had traveled up the Japanese chain of command and apparently stopped somewhere in the middle, unanswered, the way urgent questions sometimes do when no one above you has an answer, and admitting that is inconvenient. Merritt read it again. Then he turned off the flashlight. In the darkness of the motor pool, surrounded by 23 vehicles that his commanding general had declared unsuitable, that his predecessor had accepted without complaint, and that every staff officer above him had already written off as temporary inconveniences awaiting replacement, Doyle Merritt allowed himself one thought that he would not share with anyone, not that night, possibly not ever. The Japanese staff officer understood what this vehicle was before Breckinridge did. He stood up, put the clipboard under his arm, and walked back to his quarters in the dark. In 3 weeks, his regiment would begin a movement that would test every assumption the Army had made about wheeled vehicles in the Pacific. General Breckinridge would send a telegram of congratulation. Then he would add one sentence: "Keep them on the flank, not the point." Merritt would read that sentence and say nothing. He was already thinking about a bridge. Movement is its own kind of argument. You can write a report, you can file an assessment, you can sign your name beneath a paragraph declaring that a particular vehicle in a particular theater, under particular conditions, is unsuitable for frontline operations. Words on paper have a certain authority. The authority of institutions, of process, of men who have risen high enough that their opinions become policy without anyone testing them against the ground. But movement does not lie. On November the 4th, 1944, the 9th Mechanized Reconnaissance Regiment departed its staging area on the southern coast of Leyte and began pushing north. The objective was the assembly area near Lingayen Gulf, a sea crossing, then overland through the mountain roads of central Luzon. The distance was approximately 480 miles. Headquarters had allocated 30 days. Standard planning based on standard assumptions about what wheeled vehicles could manage on Philippine roads in the early wet season, in the rain, on surfaces that appeared on maps as roads, and revealed themselves on the ground as something considerably more conditional. The 9th Regiment completed it in 18 days. Merritt pushed his vehicles hard but not recklessly. He understood the difference, understood it the way men understand things they have paid for, with experience rather than read in a manual. He kept his drivers rotating through rest cycles, kept the maintenance crews working through the night at each halt, kept the fuel trucks moving just behind the lead elements so no vehicle ever sat waiting for a resupply that hadn't arrived yet. The M8 Scouts ran at 40 miles an hour on the coastal highway sections, dropped to 20 on the mountain tracks, and averaged a pace that the Army's logistics planners, when they eventually calculated it, found difficult to account for within their existing frameworks. 14 tracked vehicles attempted to move with the regiment during the first week, half-tracks mostly, attached from a support battalion that had been ordered to consolidate with the 9th for the journey north. By day 4, 6 of the half-tracks had thrown tracks on the mountain sections. By day 7, all 14 had fallen behind and were awaiting recovery. Merritt's regiment did not wait. It moved. On the 12th day, a telegram arrived from General Breckinridge at 6th Army headquarters. It was brief, it acknowledged the pace of movement, and described it, in the careful language of staff communications, as noteworthy. Then it added a single sentence: "Maintain regiment in flank security role upon arrival. Primary axis reserved for armored elements." Merritt read the telegram twice. He had a growing collection of decisions made by men who had not seen the ground. He had begun to think of them as a record, not of what had been decided, but of what people had believed at the moment they decided it. Belief was not the same thing as knowledge. He had learned that in North Africa and had not stopped learning it since. He climbed back into his vehicle and the regiment kept moving. The regiment arrived at the Lingayen assembly area on November 22nd and was assigned a position on the eastern flank of the main advance, precisely where Breckinridge's telegram had specified. The terrain on the eastern flank was not, by any objective measure, secondary terrain. It was a network of river valleys and ridgelines running north to south, crossed at irregular intervals by bridges of varying quality and load capacity, threaded through by roads that appeared on maps as solid lines and revealed themselves on the ground as something considerably more provisional. It was, in other words, exactly the terrain that Whitfield had described in the motor pool on Leyte 3 weeks earlier. Merritt spent the first 4 days on the flank doing what the orders said: security patrols, route reconnaissance, liaison work with the infantry battalions holding the eastern approaches. His vehicle commanders reported back with the thoroughness he had trained into them: road conditions, bridge specifications, observed Japanese positions, estimated unit strengths. He read every report. He built a picture. The picture that emerged was not the picture that appeared in the 6th Army planning documents. On the 3rd day, one of his forward scout sections, moving along a secondary track 12 miles northeast of the main axis, came around a bend and found something that was not on any map and had not been mentioned in any intelligence summary forwarded to the regiment. A Japanese logistics column, 16 trucks, 4 ammunition carts and a small armed escort, moving south along a track the Japanese apparently believed was too narrow and too remote for American vehicles to access. The scout section commander, a 24-year-old lieutenant named Gareth Hollis, who had been with the regiment since Georgia, made a decision in approximately 45 seconds. He called it in, requested authority to engage, and when the acknowledgement from regiment came back authorizing interdiction, he positioned his 3 vehicles across the track and opened fire. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. When it was over, the Japanese column had ceased to exist as a functioning logistics element. Hollis reported 1 M8 Scout with a cracked windshield from debris. No personnel casualties. The action report traveled up the chain of command with the day's other paperwork. When it reached Breckinridge's staff, someone, Merritt never found out who, added a notation in the margin: action outside assigned patrol parameters, regiment to maintain sector boundaries. There was no commendation. There was no acknowledgement that the interdiction had cut a supply route feeding Japanese forces on the northern flank for the better part of 2 weeks, as subsequent intelligence would later confirm. There was a reminder about sector boundaries. Merritt read the notation, set the report down, and went back to his map. The road to San Marcos ran northeast from the main assembly area through 18 miles of terrain that makes military planners age faster than combat does. It climbed through 3 ridgelines, crossed 4 river tributaries, and passed through 2 villages that had changed hands twice already and bore the architectural evidence of both transitions. San Marcos itself sat at the convergence of 3 valley roads, which was precisely why it mattered. Whoever held San Marcos held the junction. Whoever held the junction controlled the movement of supplies to the entire northern sector of the Japanese 14th Area Army. The plan, as Merritt received it on the evening of December 8th, was straightforward. The 37th Infantry Division would advance up the main road from the south. 3 Sherman tanks from the attached armored battalion would lead, clearing any roadblocks before the infantry came forward. The 9th Reconnaissance Regiment would cover the eastern approach, flank security, route monitoring, the now familiar assignment that placed Merritt's vehicles in a position to observe the battle without being part of it. The plan lasted until approximately 9:45 on the morning of December the 9th, when the lead Sherman hit the first mine. The road south of San Marcos, as the Japanese engineers had designed it, was not simply mined. It was architecturally mined, a sequence of anti-tank mines laid not to stop a single vehicle, but to channel the reaction of whatever came behind it. The first Sherman detonated the first mine at a bend where the road narrowed between a rock face and a 200-foot drop. The explosion disabled the track and shifted the vehicle sideways, partially blocking the road. The second Sherman, coming forward to assist, detonated the second mine 20 yards further on. It burned. The third Sherman, backing to avoid the burning wreck, slid off the road shoulder on the downhill side and came to rest at an angle that made recovery impossible without equipment that was not, at that moment, anywhere near San Marcos. 11 minutes. 3 Shermans gone without a single Japanese soldier firing a rifle. The road south of San Marcos was now blocked by 40 tons of burning and immobilized American armor. The infantry battalion behind them could not pass. The artillery could not pass. The entire main axis of the assault had stopped at a bend in a mountain road, and the Japanese positions above San Marcos, the ones the Shermans had been supposed to suppress, were entirely intact. Breckinridge's operations officer called Merritt at 10:17. "The main axis is blocked. We need to know if there is an alternate route to San Marcos from your sector." Merritt had the map in his hands before the call ended. He already knew the answer. He had known it since the second morning on the flank, when one of his vehicle commanders had reported a timber bridge crossing the Cagayan tributary 8 miles northeast. A bridge that appeared on no current military map because it had been built by a Filipino logging company in 1931 and was not considered significant enough for the Army Corps of Engineers to have surveyed it. Merritt had surveyed it himself, driving out with 2 vehicles on a morning when the orders said to conduct routine patrol. He had walked the bridge on foot. He had measured the span, estimated the timber dimensions, calculated the load rating the way Whitfield had taught him to think about these things. 12 tons, give or take, maybe 14 if the dry season had hardened the wood sufficiently. He picked up the radio handset. "There is a timber bridge," he said, 8 miles northeast. "Estimated load rating 12 tons. It will not hold a Sherman. It will hold my vehicles." There was a pause on the other end. He could hear, distantly, the sound of burning. "You are certain about the load rating?" "No," Merritt said. "I am certain about the mathematics. The bridge either holds or it does not. There is only one way to know." Another pause. Then, "Proceed." Merritt led the column himself. He put his own vehicle at the front, not as theatre, not as the kind of performed bravery that junior officers sometimes mistake for leadership, but because he was the one who had calculated the load rating, and he was therefore the one who should bear the first consequence if the calculation was wrong. That was a simple principle. His father had taught it to him in a different context, in a different world, but the principle transferred without difficulty. The bridge held. It held the first vehicle and the second, and by the time the 4th M8 Scout had crossed, and the sound of the timber settling under each successive load had become familiar, rather than alarming, Merritt understood that the mathematics had been right. The Japanese engineers had designed their mine patterns and their defensive positions with the main road in mind. They had not planned for a flanking force coming from the northeast across a logging bridge that should not, by any military planning logic, have been part of the operational calculation. The regiment came through the trees above San Marcos at 11:43, from a direction the Japanese defenders had not fortified, moving at a pace that gave the defenders perhaps 90 seconds of warning before the lead vehicles were inside their perimeter. What happened in the next 20 minutes would later appear in the regimental after-action report in the measured language of military documentation. Enemy positions engaged, resistance encountered, objectives secured. The language is accurate as far as it goes. What it does not capture, because military after-action reports are not designed to capture such things, is the specific quality of those 20 minutes as experienced from inside an M8 Scout moving through an enemy position at 30 miles an hour. The Japanese response was rapid and professionally executed given the circumstances. Heavy machine guns opened from 2 positions on the northern edge of the town. A 37mm anti-tank gun, the same caliber as Merritt's own main armament, engaged from a concealed position near a stone building on the main road and struck one of the trailing M8 Scouts in the rear quarter panel. The vehicle did not stop. The round did not penetrate. The weld held. The Japanese anti-tank gun crew had one more shot before a high explosive round from the second vehicle in the column put them out of the engagement. Then the infantry came. Merritt had seen the tactical reports. He understood what was about to happen before it happened, and understanding it did not make it easier to watch. The Japanese defensive plan for San Marcos had been designed around the assumption that American armor would approach on the main road from the south, where the anti-tank weapons were concentrated. When the armor came instead from the northeast, the defensive plan inverted. The machine gun positions were angled wrong, the anti-tank reserves were on the wrong side of town, and the infantry, trained, prepared, committed, had no option remaining except to close the distance on foot. They came across open ground. Merritt said 2 words into the radio handset. The first M8 Scout to fire canister did so at a range of 180 yards. The sound was unlike the crack of the 37mm armor-piercing round, unlike the flat bang of high explosive. It was something between a thunderclap and an industrial impact, a noise that contained within it the physics of 122 steel balls dispersing in a cone pattern across 80 yards of open ground. A document recovered from a Japanese officer's satchel after the battle, later translated by Army intelligence, contained a single paragraph written in the margin of a tactical map. Written, the ink suggested, sometime in the 20 minutes before the officer died. The translation read, "We were given weapons for a different enemy. The wheeled vehicles move too fast for our guns and do not stop when hit. The infantry cannot close with them. We have no answer for this. Request this information reach division before the next engagement." The request did not reach division. The satchel was recovered from a position on the northern edge of San Marcos by a sergeant in Hollis's scout section who passed it up the chain of command with the routine paperwork of the afternoon. San Marcos fell at 14:20. The junction was secured. The road north was open. That night, Merritt sat in his vehicle with the engine off and the hatch open, listening to the sounds of a town settling into the quiet that follows violence. He could hear his maintenance crews moving between the vehicles, checking damage, logging repairs. He could hear, further away, the infantry units establishing their perimeter for the night. He thought about Whitfield, back in Manila or Detroit or wherever the Ordnance Department had sent him next, and about the morning in the motor pool when Whitfield had placed his hand on the hull and talked about rivets and load ratings and the specific number 122. He thought about the Japanese officer who had written in the margin of a tactical map in the last 20 minutes of his life, a professional, a man doing his job in conditions that had become impossible, writing down what he had learned so that someone else might use it. He thought about the bridge and the mathematics, and the way certainty is never quite the same thing as proof. That proof only comes after, when the thing either holds or it doesn't. The bridge had held. He put the map away and closed the hatch. 200 miles north, the campaign was waiting. Tomorrow, the regiment that nobody wanted would go and meet it. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep. You can sleep 8 hours and wake up carrying it. You can eat, rest, sit in the shade while someone else drives, and still feel it in the specific weight behind your eyes and in the way your hands move slightly slower than your mind intends. It is not physical. It is the exhaustion of sustained vigilance, of being the man who must always be right because the men around you cannot afford for you to be wrong. Doyle Merritt had been carrying that exhaustion since North Africa. By January 1945, pushing through the Luzon Plain with 200 miles of road still ahead of him, it had become as familiar as his own name. He did not put it down. There was nowhere to put it yet. The advance from San Marcos north toward the Japanese rear areas began on December 14, 1944, and proceeded in a manner that the official campaign histories would later describe as rapid and decisive, 2 words that contain within them a great deal of mud, mechanical failure, ambush, counter-ambush, improvised bridge repair, and the grinding arithmetic of keeping 23 vehicles operational across terrain that treated machinery as a personal enemy. By the first week of January, the regiment had covered 90 miles. By the end of the month, 140. The Japanese forces retreating north were not broken. They were compressed, falling back in disciplined increments, giving ground only when the tactical mathematics demanded it, fighting hard enough at each position to slow the American advance without committing to engagements they could not win. It was professional soldiering under impossible conditions, and Merritt recognized it for what it was. He had fought the same way in different places on different ground when the situation had been reversed. He pushed anyway. That was the job. His vehicle losses during the advance were two: not to anti-tank guns, not to artillery, not to the 37mm weapons that the Japanese had positioned on the main roads expecting Shermans. Both were lost to mines, improvised devices buried in road surfaces that the engineers had not identified before the lead scout sections rolled over them. The first vehicle lost a wheel assembly, and its driver spent 4 days in a field hospital before returning to duty. The second was a total loss. The mine had been large enough, placed precisely enough, that the blast came up through the floor rather than against the side armor, and the mathematics that had protected the regiment's vehicles in every other engagement were simply not relevant to a force directed vertically through the chassis from beneath. The crew survived. The vehicle did not. Merritt wrote both incident reports himself in detail. He noted the mine types where identifiable, the placement patterns, the ground conditions that had concealed them from forward reconnaissance. He sent the reports up the chain of command with recommendations for modifying patrol protocols. He received no response to the recommendations. He implemented them anyway, unilaterally, and lost no further vehicles to mines for the remainder of the campaign. During the same period, the armoured battalion operating on the main axis, and the Shermans, the vehicles that 6th Army planning documents described as the primary striking force of the Luzon campaign, lost 31 tanks, anti-tank guns, mines, artillery, mechanical breakdown accelerated by terrain the vehicles were not designed for. 31 Shermans, each weighing 30 tons, each requiring a recovery operation that consumed time and men and resources the advance could not afford to spend. Nobody put those two numbers beside each other in an official document. 2 M8 scouts against 31 Shermans. Merritt noticed he did not mention it. Mentioning it would have required a kind of institutional honesty that was not, in his experience, a feature of headquarters communications in the middle of a campaign. There would be time for honesty later, or there would not be. Either way, the road continued north. The regiment reached the outskirts of the final objective, the junction town of Apari, at the northern tip of Luzon, where the Cagayan River meets the South China Sea, on April 9, 1945. The Japanese forces in the north had been cut off from resupply for 6 weeks. The men they faced were not the organized defensive units of December. They were hungry, under-equipped, and operating without reliable communication with what remained of the 14th Area Army command structure. They fought with the ferocity of men who have nothing left to calculate. The approach to Apari cost Merritt 3 days of careful, grinding work. The Japanese had mined the final road approaches, placed machine gun positions in the buildings along the main street, and constructed a series of anti-vehicle barriers from damaged trucks and felled timber that forced the M8 scouts into single-file movement through lanes that had been pre-registered for mortar fire. It was not elegant. It was the work of men who understood that the end was coming and intended to make it as expensive as possible. On the morning of April the 12th, Lieutenant Gareth Hollis, the same 24-year-old who had made the 45-second decision on the remote track in November, brought his scout section through the last barrier on the northern edge of Apari and reported the road clear to the river. The Cagayan River, beyond which there was only water and, eventually, open sea. There was nowhere further north to go. The 9th Mechanized Reconnaissance Regiment had reached the end of Luzon. The telegram from General Breckinridge arrived at regimental headquarters on April 14th. It was longer than the one from November, 3 full paragraphs rather than 2 sentences. It acknowledged the regiment's performance during the campaign, cited specific engagements including San Marcos and the interdiction action on the northern track, and described the unit's contribution to the Luzon campaign as significant. It did not use the word exceptional. It did not use the word decisive. Both of those words had been used in the same week in communiques describing the performance of the armoured battalion on the main axis. The regiment received 7 battle honours, formally awarded and entered into the regimental record. The citations were accurate. They described what had happened in the language that battle honour citations use: precise dates, grid references, outcomes. They did not explain why wheeled vehicles had done what no one in the planning process had believed wheeled vehicles could do, or what that meant for the assessments that had been written before the campaign began. Merritt read the honours citation, signed the acknowledgement form, and filed it with the other papers. He was not, by nature, a man who needed institutional approval to understand the value of what he had done. He had been raised by a man who measured worth in plainer terms by whether the work was done and done correctly, and whether the men entrusted to you came home. By those measures, the campaign had been a success. The work was done. San Marcos had fallen from the one direction the Japanese had not prepared for. The road north had stayed open. Of the men who had crossed the timber bridge above San Marcos in December, all of them were alive in April. That was not nothing. In the mathematics of infantry, it was close to everything. What he received in return was a letter in late May 1945 informing him that his name had been removed from the current cycle of Brigadier General consideration. The letter offered no explanation. It noted that his record would be reviewed in the following annual cycle and that his service remained valued by the Army. The language was careful in the specific way of letters written by men who know exactly what they are doing and have decided to leave no evidence of the reasoning behind it. He read the letter once. He did not read it again. He folded it and placed it in his breast pocket with the orders, the telegram, and everything else he had been carrying since Leyte. A record not of what had been decided, but of what people had believed. The pocket was getting heavy. He thought, briefly, that his father would have had something to say about that. Something plain and direct, the kind of thing that does not require elaboration. He did not try to reconstruct what it would have been. He put on his jacket and went back to work. Edmund Whitfield was dismissed from his consulting position with the Ordnance Department in September 1945, 6 weeks after the formal Japanese surrender. The official reason cited in his termination papers was a reorganization of civilian technical advisory functions following the transition to peacetime operations. Standard language, the kind that could mean anything or nothing depending on who was reading it. What the termination papers did not mention was the series of memos Whitfield had submitted to the Ordnance Department between February and June 1945, documenting the M8 Scouts' performance data from the Luzon campaign and recommending, in precise technical language, that the official assessment signed by General Breckinridge in September 1944 be formally reviewed and revised. The memos were well sourced. They cited engagement reports, maintenance logs, vehicle loss comparisons, and the bridge load calculations from the Cagayan tributary crossing. They were thorough in the way that Whitfield did everything, with the methodical patience of a man who believes that if you present the evidence correctly, the conclusion will follow necessarily. The memos received no formal response. Whitfield returned to Detroit and spent the following decade consulting independently, selling engineering licenses to defense contractors in 6 countries. He died in 1969, not wealthy, in the house he had lived in since before the war. Among his papers, his daughter found a manila envelope containing photocopies of the Ordnance Department memos and a short, handwritten note, undated, in his precise engineer's script. The vehicle worked. The record shows it worked. What the record does not show is why nobody wanted to say so. The M8 Scout was adopted by 14 nations after the war's end. It outlived nearly every tank it had served alongside. It outlived the assessment that had declared it unsuitable. It outlived Whitfield, and would in time outlive most of the men who had driven it through the mud and the dark and the rain of a campaign that the history books would spend the next 50 years describing primarily through the actions of the armored divisions on the main axis. In June 1962, a classified digest circulated within the upper levels of the Army's Historical Documentation Division. It contained, among other items, a summary of personal journals donated to the Army archives by the estates of officers who had died in the preceding years. One of the items was a passage from the personal journal of General Clifford Breckinridge, who had died in March 1962 at the age of 70. The passage was dated December 9, 1944, the night after San Marcos. It read, "Read Merritt's engagement report tonight. He took the bridge. He was right about the bridge. He was right about the vehicle. I have been wrong about both since September, and I have known it since at least November, and I have not said so because saying so would require acknowledging the assessment, and the assessment has my signature on it, and there is no version of that conversation that ends well for anyone at this stage of the campaign. This is not a decision I am proud of. I am noting it here because it should be noted somewhere, even if it is noted nowhere else." The digest was classified. It circulated to perhaps 30 people. Merritt was not among them. He was by then working as a military advisor to two newly independent African nations, living out of a single bag, moving between assignments with the same economy of motion he had applied to everything since the Army had run out of uses for him. He did not speak publicly about Luzon. He did not write a memoir. The men who worked alongside him in those years described him as exacting, patient, and possessed of a very precise understanding of the difference between what an organization says it values and what it actually rewards. He trained good soldiers. He built good units. He went home when the work was done. On April the 25th, 1974, in Lisbon, Portugal, a military coup ended 48 years of authoritarian rule in what became known to history as the Carnation Revolution. The coup was carried out by the Armed Forces Movement, a coalition of military officers who had grown disillusioned with a regime that had sent them to fight unwinnable colonial wars in Africa for over a decade. The vehicle that appeared at the head of the column, moving through central Lisbon in the early hours of that morning, was a wheeled armored car, four-wheel drive, with a turret-mounted main gun and a welded hull manufactured in 1943. It was 31 years old. It had been purchased by the Portuguese military in the post-war procurement cycle and had served in various capacities for 3 decades, including service in the colonial campaigns in Angola and Mozambique that the officers of the Armed Forces Movement had spent years fighting and finally refused to continue. The vehicle moved through the streets of Lisbon without firing. The Portuguese population, which had been told by its government for 48 years that the military existed to protect the regime, came out of their houses and watched. They did not run. They brought flowers, carnations, the flower that was in season, the flower that gave the revolution its name, and placed them in the barrels of guns that were not firing and showed no sign of firing. The soldiers in the vehicles accepted the flowers. The dictatorship ended without a shot. The vehicle in the photograph that ran on the front pages of newspapers across the world the following morning, the image that became the defining visual record of that day, was the M8 Scout. You can see the welded turret seam if you know what you are looking for. You can see the four-wheel configuration. You can see the 37mm gun barrel with a carnation placed carefully in its mouth by a woman in a grey coat who is looking at the camera with an expression that belongs only to people who have just watched a thing they believe to be permanent reveal itself as temporary. It was the last documented operational deployment of the M8 Scout anywhere in the world, not in a jungle, not at a narrow bridge above a river tributary where the mathematics of load ratings determined the outcome of a battle. In a European capital, on a spring morning, 31 years after it was built. In 1978, a small American academic press published a translated collection of Japanese military documents from the Pacific Campaign. Among them was the full text of the tactical assessment written in late 1944 by a staff officer of the Japanese 14th Area Army, the complete document from which only fragments had previously appeared in American intelligence summaries. The officer's name was not attached to the published translation. The final paragraph read, "The American Wheeled Armored Unit presents a tactical problem for which our current doctrine has no established answer. It is faster than our response capability. It crosses terrain we have not defended because we did not believe it capable of crossing. Its armor defeats our anti-tank weapons at the ranges where those weapons can be accurately employed." The men who drive it appear to understand these advantages in ways their command structure does not. This is either good fortune for them or bad planning by us. Possibly both. Either way, the result is the same. We have no answer for this vehicle. Request that this assessment reach those who plan our defenses before we meet it again. The request reached nobody in time to matter, but the record was there. The engagement reports, the battle honors, the maintenance logs, the load calculations in Merritt's own handwriting on the back of a map beside a tributary of the Cagayan River. All of it sitting in the archives, waiting for anyone who looked far enough and cared enough to find it. The bridge had held. He had measured it himself, on foot, in the rain, before anyone gave him permission to cross. The M8 Scout served in the armed forces of 14 nations after World War II. India and Pakistan operated them into the 1960s. Portugal used them until 1974. The official US Army assessment declaring them unsuitable for jungle operations was never formally revised. General Breckinridge's personal journal was declassified in 1978. Lieutenant Colonel Doyle Merritt's name does not appear in the index of any major published history of the Luzon campaign.